All right, everybody, welcome back. This is going to be our third and final set of notes for Chapter 30, The Crisis of Authority. Last time we kind of talked about Richard Nixon's presidency and his policies, particularly when it came to foreign policy and the relationship with Henry Kissinger. That is where Nixon really shined. That is where his strengths were politically. And like I kind of mentioned yesterday, Richard Nixon was a very good politician in a lot of ways. Uh, and ultimately, it's the fact, that he was such a shrewd politician that probably leads to his downfall. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of the domestic things going on during Nixon's presidency, as well as obviously the Watergate break-in, which I'll get into a little bit here, but actually we'll discuss it a little more length in class. So that being said, let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm really going to try this time around to keep this thing a little bit shorter, but you know how that works. All right. So a lot of the stuff we're going to hit today is going to deal with economic policy and economic problems that really hampered Nixon's administration and, frankly, all the presidencies of the 1970s until somebody came along for president in 1980 and dealt with some hard times at first, but ultimately saved our country from ultimate ruin. And we'll talk about him at great length in chapter 31. So, first thing for Nixon, the first term of his presidency goes relatively well. Um, good enough, I guess you could say. Now, remember, he kind of barely won in 1968, at least in terms of the popular vote. Things would be very different in 1972. Nixon actually is very much helped by the fact that his opponent in 1972 is George McGovern. George McGovern is kind of like, again, how Eugene McCarthy was like a 60s version of Bernie Sanders. George McGovern is kind of a little bit, and this is maybe a little bit too unfair of a comparison for McGovern, but he was from the liberal wing of the Democrats in 1972, so he's almost like a 70s version of AOC, of Alexander Ocasio Cortez, whose ideas are very far to the left. And ultimately, this just isn't a time where Americans want that. They made that perfectly clear in electing Nixon in 1968, who nobody really liked, but America, by the early 1970s, the voting population, which is largely wealthy, middle class, and white, is still kind of tired of the social change, of the Great Society programs, and ultimately the increased burden that puts on people in terms of taxation, and just the idea in the minds of many people that so many people are getting all these government handouts without seemingly have to do any work. Now, McGovern is a big supporter of a lot of these social programs. Ironically, he comes from South Dakota, which is really kind of weird. And America overwhelmingly shows in the election in 1972 that that's just not what they want right now. So Nixon in 72 wins 49 states, every state but the District of Columbia. This turns out to be the biggest electoral landslide. To that point, there would be one worse. The biggest electoral landslide in American history. He won 49 of 50 states. The only one he didn't win was Massachusetts, and he also didn't win the District of Columbia. He gets over 60% of the popular vote, and the people overwhelmingly say, we don't want all this social change. We want to back off of that and kind of, get things back to at least a little bit of what we remember of what is normal. So Nixon wins an easy election in 1972 that ultimately isn't really even that close. You know how they show the election results on TV the night of the election, and of course the last two took time to be decided, but this one was probably over by 8:30 at night. Everybody knew Richard Nixon was going to be elected again. That's an important thing to consider when we get to Watergate a little bit later. So, however, despite winning the election, Nixon is forced to deal with a lot of economic problems. There's a lot of economic trouble. things, I talked about the inflation rate going up in the 1960s. By this point, it's continuing to get worse. Inflation is still growing. So we've got a lot of economic problems, right? And America, this new generation of America is not used to economic problems. We have been growing steadily, ever since World War II. With a couple troubles in there, but the 50s were pretty good. The late 40s and through the 50s were really good economically. The 60s were really strong economically, and here we are in the 70s, where we really face in America this really troubling and difficult economic period. And there's a lot of sources for that. And one of the big sources, which I mentioned in the last video, is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, who in 1973, as I mentioned yesterday, in the last video, kind of put an embargo on sending oil to the United States, which caused a big rise in gas prices, which was problematic in petroleum, basically because we have a good relationship with Israel, and all the Arab oil exporting countries were upset about that. So they say, well, if you support Israel, we're not going to give you any oil. It becomes a big problem for America. Gas prices go through the roof, and there's a shortage of gas available. This coupled with the general energy crisis of the early 1970s, with which a lot of energy sources, raw materials and sources are very limited. That's a big problem. Okay? Making matters worse, I mentioned before inflation. Inflation rates continue to skyrocket in the early 1970s. Basically, the reason for this is that goods are costing more money than they used to, for a bunch of reasons. The United States had been the economic powerhouse of the world for much of the 20th century, and certainly since World War II. And we depended on many raw materials from a lot of third world countries that basically had a difficult time, for lack of a better term, standing up for themselves. Well, by the 1970s, these third world countries are realizing just how dependent first world countries like the United States are dependent on their goods, and they start rising prices for raw materials, which means at home we have to raise prices for raw materials as well, which makes things more expensive, which causes the inflation rate to go up and creating all kinds of economic problems. Another big factor in the troubled economy of the early 1970s has to do with manufacturing. The backbone of the United States ever since the late 1800s in terms of jobs has been the strong manufacturing base. Well, the problem is the United States does so much to help rebuild Europe and Japan and other parts of the world that they have all the latest and newest factories and machines and methods and stuff like that. And in the United States, our factories are dilapidated and old, and people are depending more and more on foreign goods. What this means is the beginning of the long, and some would say still continuing process of the decline of manufacturing in the United States. Okay, fewer manufacturing jobs being available to people is a problem that really starts to creep up in really in the 1970s. As fewer and fewer manufacturing jobs are available for people, and people depend on foreign countries for things. It's the 70s where you start to see Japanese cars become more popular in the United States. What that means is people aren't buying American cars, which means we don't need as many factories, which means you close some factories, which means a lot of people that work there lose jobs. The manufacturing base of the United States is shrinking and continue to do so, which creates other problems that I'll touch on later on as well, but things like underemployment, unemployment, obviously. Underemployment is basically people that have jobs that are less than what their skill set are. Say you get a college degree and you work as a waitress or a waiter at a restaurant. That's technically kind of underemployment. if your level of educational attainment or skill doesn't equal the job with which you're doing. Big problem. Okay. Um, Another big problem, and this is a kind of a complicated thing, and you'll get it in another form from me as well, uh, is this new concept that really plagues the 1970s, but particularly the presidency of Richard Nixon, called stagflation. Stagflation is a really bad thing that happens. It's a rare economic occurrence when there's very high inflation during a period where there's no economic growth. In other words, the price of goods goes up, but there's no seeming reason for it, right? When the economy's not growing, prices shouldn't go up, okay? But when there's stagflation, that means, in other words, the cost of goods is going up, and at the same time, people aren't making more money. That's stagflation. It's a really bad situation. It creates a bad economic climate in the countries where it happens or when it happens, and it's relatively rare. Uh, and that really plagues the United States and particularly the presidency of Richard Nixon. And it really exists throughout the 70s and into the early 1980s. So Nixon is going to have to figure something out to do about these growing economic problems. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot he can do. Okay? With the cost of goods continually increasing, with the cost of goods continually increasing, you know, the problem is not is something that's beyond his control. Inflation is going to continue to grow, to continue to go up, and the cost of goods is going to continue to go up, and until more deals are worked out with foreign countries or whatever, these third world countries that we depend on for so many goods are going to continue to charge us more because they realize more and more how dependent they are on American goods, or I'm sorry, how dependent America is on their resources and goods. Okay, so um, the Nixon response is, while I don't want to call it non-existent, um, is really kind of weak and unsuccessful. Jobs continue to be lost, the manufacturing base continues to be weakened, and it sets the stage for an economic circumstance that's going to continue throughout the 70s into the early 80s, plaguing the presidencies of both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. All right, so here's a map of the election of 1972. You can see the only places that McGovern won were the District of Columbia and the state of Massachusetts. Nixon gets, over 60% of the vote to about 37, 38% of the vote for McGovern, and Nixon wins 520 electoral votes. That, my friends, is a red wave for sure. Again, here's another image of kind of the inflation of the night of this time period. You can see we kind of hit a high inflation rate early 1970. It goes down, but it shoots back up again and stays up really into the early 1980s. And then again, some better leadership and stronger leadership at the presidential level allows that by 1983 and in 84 that inflation rate to plummet to a much more manageable and acceptable level. All right. So continuing on, kind of talking about Nixon a little bit here. Nixon domestically, as president, really one of his primary goals is a couple things. Nixon has this belief in something that he calls the silent majority. And the silent majority basically is Nixon's belief that most Americans, a majority of Americans, support his efforts, support the efforts of the government, support what's going on in Vietnam, but they just don't say anything about it. They're not loud about it, right? The voices that we hear are the protesters, are the people that are loud, but they represent a minority rather than a significant majority. We see the same thing today. The silent majority is a concept that still exists today. You know, most people, maybe believe one thing or another. Most people probably believe that COVID-19 is dangerous, but it's the ones that say it out loud that are really vocal about it, or the ones that say that it's not dangerous, make that group seem a lot louder or a lot more numerous than they actually are. Nixon has a strong belief in the silent majority, believing that most people say, hey, what's going on in Vietnam, and their policies are okay. What's going on domestically, people are okay with the job Nixon's doing, even though there's lots of loud voices that are very critical of his. Nixon pursues a move, obviously, as a Republican, towards a more conservative approach. And this is the beginning of kind of a change a little bit in conservative practice. Nixon, that's a horrible looking conservative, by the way. Nixon generally, believes that, Americans really want to return to kind of a more family values-based society that, isn't as hung up on great society programs. Okay? Nixon believes, like he learned under the presidency of Eisenhower when Nixon was vice president, that all these social programs cost the country a great deal of money. And frankly, they do. That's a big part of the problem of the weakening economy, because while we're waging a war and spending money on a war, at the same time, we're trying to fund all these programs. So Nixon looks at it and says, under Eisenhower's presidency, we depended economically on the worker, on a strong manufacturing base and financial base, and if people are making money, they'll become consumers and spend money. We need to back off on some of these great society type programs. So Nixon does a lot of work to kind of roll back on a lot of the great society programs, cutting money to them, coming up with other plans that really aren't bad ideas, such as restructuring welfare to grant families that are poor or on welfare kind of a certain amount of money each year, and then basically say, okay, use that money and you have to manage it yourself and you're on your own after that point. This seemingly a good idea, and most Americans support it, but those on welfare, complain that it's certainly not enough to help them survive and thrive. Okay, so you could go either way with that argument. Certainly different people are going to say and believe different things when it comes to, how much is enough help. So we see under Nixon kind of a backing off of some of these great society programs, not a total elimination, but certainly a backing off to a certain degree, to kind of lessen the burden on the American taxpayer and lessen the burden of the federal government in an effort to find a way to save some money, save taxpayers a little bit, and cut back on federal deficits. So now let's move on and talk a little bit about Watergate. Okay, simply put, what happened? Nixon tries to cover up a crime that was committed by associates of Nixon. This cover-up is a crime. It's a crime called obstruction of justice. Okay? And essentially, Nixon was guilty of that crime as president. So to avoid being removed from office, impeached and removed, Richard Nixon was never impeached. Nixon resigned to avoid that embarrassment. So how does it happen? Now, before I mention George McGovern and how Nixon blew him away in the election, this is the ironic thing about it. So the Watergate Hotel is a hotel that's still there in Washington, D.C., and um, basically it was the headquarters of McGovern's presidential campaign. So Nixon had some of his guys, um, people that were called, well, the people behind it were called were called the creeps, which that's an acronym that actually stands for the Committee to Re-elect the President. Under them was a group of people that's job was to fix problems. They were known as the plumbers. The plumbers broke into the Watergate Hotel, into McGovern's office, to find information regarding, his plans and his, election strategy and stuff like that. Well, they got caught and they got arrested. After this happened, people dug into it, learned more and more about it, and found out that these people were associated with Nixon's campaign, and Nixon denied any knowledge of their involvement, continuously denying this involvement. Ultimately, as time went on and the thing got closer and closer to Nixon, a special prosecutor was hired. A special prosecutor is someone who's hired basically by the government to look into maybe something illegal that a president may have done. That is like who Robert Mueller was in the whole Russia investigation a couple of years ago that got Trump impeached the first time. The special prosecutor in the case of the Watergate break-in was a guy by the name of Archibald Cox. As Cox continued to dig, things got closer and closer to the president. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign because he broke some laws in accepting some campaign bribes when he was the governor of Maryland. It was unrelated to Watergate. And ultimately, Nixon gets really, really nervous, and he oversteps his bounds as president and fires Archibald Cox and the deputy attorney general. Nixon can't do that. That is obstruction of justice. He's getting in the way of a federal investigation. So ultimately, what happens is basically a bunch of Republican leaders in Congress go to Nixon and say, "Listen, man, this isn't going to end well. I think for the good of everybody, yourself included, you really ought to resign from the presidency." Nixon reluctantly agrees, and on August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigns from office, becoming the only president to ever resign the presidency and avoid the embarrassment of impeachment and probably conviction. That's essentially what happens to the Watergate, in the Watergate situation. What's the long-term impact of that? Well, the American people feel cheated, they feel lied to, rightfully so, and the limited trust that existed in the government, which had already been damaged by the events of the 60s and 70s, Vietnam, the Kent State shooting, the Christmas bombings, the Pentagon Papers, and all this other stuff, really destroys any confidence that people have in our federal government. And it's going to take the rest of the 70s and a little bit into the 80s before that confidence and belief in our federal systems of government actually begin to get restored. All right, so that is it. It's a little bit shorter, but I was hoping for under 20 minutes. We'll get there. But that's the end of chapter 30. Again, we'll discuss some of this in class, but this is the more depthful stuff that we've gone over here. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time.